Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Leaders in Astrology series. Today, we are honored and privileged to have highly esteemed astrologer, author, and lecturer Bruce Scofield joining us today. So, thank you so much for joining us today, and how are you doing?
Not too bad.
So, I'd like to start from the beginning. So, can you tell us where you're from, where you grew up, and how you first became interested in astrology?
Sure. Uh, I was born and raised in New Jersey, central New Jersey. And it was somewhere around the time I was about 17 or 18, I began to notice a pattern that my friends and girlfriends were all born around October 10th or 11th or 9th. There was definitely a pattern there. And this was interesting to me because I was early in life, I was interested in science. I still am, but particularly astronomy and paleontology. So the astronomy side of myself said, well, okay, this means that the Earth is in the same part of its orbit every October 10th. So that kind of made sense to me. But one of my girlfriends actually had some astrology books. I had never come across an astrology book before. I was programmed by my readings in astronomy to think that astrology was a pseudoscience. So I looked at her books, and one of them actually had instructions on how to calculate a chart. So I did that. And another one had info, or maybe the same book had, was Safarial. Actually, these couple books by Safarial had instructions on how to calculate secondary progressions. So I did that. And then I realized that this was actually working. I mean, this was a real shock to the system. Probably, I guess I was about 18 or 19. So I stayed with it. And I dropped out of college for a while. I was at Rutgers for a couple of years, year and a half or so. And I dropped out mostly because I was had a successful rock and roll band and I was stoned half the time. So I dropped out for a few years, but that gave me time to dig deeper into astrology. And then I realized, well, I really needed the education. So I went back to school and got a degree in history with a real strong emphasis on philosophy and ancient history and things that would relate more to astrology.
Because, of course, at that time, there was no outright astrology course or anything you could do at that time. Is that correct?
Well, there was actually something pretty close. You know, Rutgers had a few interesting people there. One was Ken Negus. I don't know if that name is familiar to you. Okay, Ken Negus, he was professor of German at Rutgers, and he had written a book on German moon poetry. In the process, researched a few things about some of the authors and realized that they were very interested in astrology. So he thought he should study astrology in order to learn more about moon poetry, and he did. And like myself, he got hooked on the subject, and I heard about him, and I went to the German department and met him. And he was actually trying to promote astrology in some ways, and he formed the Rutgers Astrological Society. Now, one of the people that was in that group was Gary Kristen, who's has been doing Uranian astrology all his life. And so we met early on in the early 70s at Rutgers, and we were part of the Rutgers Astrological Society, and there were a few other people involved. And Ken Negus would arrange to have speakers come in, and one of them was Michel Gauquelin, and we had Isabel Hickey, we had John Addy. We had some very influential people.
That's a great lineup.
Yeah, so this was, I'm at college. I tried to turn my major from history into independent study in astrology, but that didn't fly. So I did wind up with a degree, a major in history and a minor in philosophy. So that got me going. That got me started. And I stayed with it and developed basically all self-taught, an ability to read charts, and started doing horoscope readings in probably about 1980 for money. And made a living at it eventually. I made a living at astrology for about 30 or 40 years, I guess. Probably entirely by astrology for about 20 of those. But I always had a sideline. I was always playing in rock and roll bands. So I'd make some pocket change there.
So what was the reaction of friends, family members when, you know, going from what you were studying into into practice, was there any raised eyebrows, or what was that environment like at that time?
Well, you know, I don't think a lot of my my parents weren't sure what that was all about. They knew, my mother knew a person who was into astrology, and she always thought it was like some kind of weird hobby. And my father didn't understand it very well. But what I did with my father, he was a very scientific type of guy, he was an electrical engineer. I said, okay, here's your chart. I'm going to, you know, predict some transits. So I looked where Mars was going to oppose his moon, or, you know, something along those lines, something that would be obvious. And I wrote them all down. And I actually timed them. You know, this is way before computers, and I was doing this on a slide rule and you know, well, this is probably even before calculators. So I would calculate the time of day that the aspect would be exact. So he went to work and brought this with him. It was, I think, a week or two's worth of transit predictions. And he came back and he said, yep, definitely works. I don't know how it did it, but it definitely works. And he never had any problem with it after that point, which is funny. I had a few uncles that kind of ridiculed it. And one of my other uncles, who is a good supporter of me, a constant supporter, said, well, you know, leave them alone. You know, it's these are the Greek gods. And I said, well, wait a second, you know, this is not about the gods. This is a methodology here. So I did the same thing with him and predicted some transits. And after that, he wanted a reading every year. So I basically converted at least 2 people in my family.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. I also insulted a few. My in-laws, one of my in-laws was very critical of astrology, and I insulted him in front of the whole family, basically showing that he didn't know what he was talking about. And that got me in a lot of trouble. I wouldn't apologize, though.
Do you think some of the misconceptions stem from people, again, not understanding astrology, but what the complexity of astrology? So knowing the astronomy, the mathematics, all that it takes to put in, because you said you actually there calculating charts by hand. Is that correct?
Yeah, with a slide rule, and then by proportions. Yeah. I don't think that a lot of the critics of astrology even get that far in evaluating the subject. They just have a knee-jerk reaction because they know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who they trust and said that astrology is a pseudoscience. I have never run into a critic of astrology that really knew very much about it.
That's an excellent point, and actually comes up to your recent, you've had an incredible body of work over your time, but your recent publication, which is The Nature of Astrology, History, Philosophy, and the Science of Self-Organizing Systems. Right. And it's such a great book, but you're touching on a few points there, which is the marginalization and the denigration of astrology, both from a theological intolerance and also what you condense down to RMM, which is the reductionist, mechanicalistic, materialistic, scientific. Wait, if I'm getting that correct?
Yeah, mechanistic.
Mechanistic, right. And so you're making the point there of, so where did that start from? When did this marginalization of astrology and this fallout of seeing it as as you said, the arguments against astrology, that people actually come up and they've not really studied it whatsoever, so they just take arguments from other people. Is that been your experience? Yeah,
I mean, I think that you know, fear and disdain for astrology has been baked into Western history for a long time. You know, part of it comes from the fact that a lot of the Hellenistic astrologers and late Roman Empire astrologers were extremely fatalistic. People don't like that. And in Christianity, you can't have any kind of fatalism because that eliminates, you know, free will, choice, prayer, so many things essential to Western religion are, you know, assume a basis of humans have a choice to make. They can choose to follow God or not. They don't like the idea that the stars have any control over it. And I think that in the Hellenistic times, there wasn't a lot of nuance on the part of astrologers about this, except for Ptolemy. But, you know, again, so much of the material back then is lost. We really don't know what it was, you know, what everybody was thinking. We know about Valens and Manilius and Firmicus and a few others. But and then during the Middle Ages, Christianity struggled with astrology, and you had people like Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, who rationalized it, said that, yeah, it works, but you really can't make exact predictions unless you enlist the help of demons. That was their solution to that. And then in the Renaissance, you had the rise of humanism, and humanism rejects any form of stellar determinism. So that was a problem too. So I think that this fear of fate is baked in, and it's of course a lot more subtle than what people think, but they don't go that far. And I think the icing on the cake was in the 17th century when science underwent a revolution and became extremely reductionist and materialist and mechanistic. And astrology couldn't be tested in that format. Still can't very well. I mean, Gauquelin did it, and other people have done it as well, but it's very difficult to do. Now, my perspective is that science is something that really started with the pre-Socratic Greeks. Logical thinking and not explaining things by supernatural means. I think that's knowledge as a collective enterprise. That's what science is. And logic, Aristotelian logic is scientific. It's a way. It's this groping, this humanity groping towards a way of making knowledge that's reliable and democratic. I like to compare scientific knowledge to democratic knowledge, because if you don't like it, you can test it. And if it doesn't test that, then you can raise an objection, and then somebody else can test it. And eventually the truth comes out, and it's predictable. So what happened with science in the 17th century was that it became very focused on reducing things to minute pieces, taking them into the laboratory, subjecting them to all sorts of experiments and getting results, and then putting it into some kind of mathematical formula. And this is like a brilliant, absolutely brilliant idea, concept that you can do this. And look what it got us. We're talking across miles of distance on this video machine here. It's amazing what science has brought. So, with those kinds of results, it just got a lot of support. It has fast institutional support. Astrology has no institutional support, very little.
And that's the key argument you're making, is that lack of institutional support and the lack of theory and the lack of studies that have come in. Because there have been a couple of studies, but a lot of them are, what in your view, some of the studies around astrology have been?
Well, I have a whole chapter on that in the book. Gauquelin did an amazing study. It's a study that's so well done, it sets a high standard for studies in any subject. It took his whole life to do it, and his wife was working with him. And it was done in a reductionist way and using statistics to, pull it together. And there are other studies, none quite on that scale. I did one with temperature. I showed that a correlation between the alignment of the sun and Saturn and temperatures, which I don't think had been done before, and got, I think, very intriguing results. That's at the very least.
And that's quite fascinating. So you were talking about the Sun-Saturn oppositions and dips in temperature. Is that correct?
Yeah. You see, the thing about reductionist science is that it requires units to measure. And if you can't put units on something, you can't do reductionist science. That's why psychology and social sciences, are not exact sciences. I mean, they've gotten better at it. You can put a unit on a person by subjecting them to a personality inventory, and then you can create units, and then you can do some kind of a study. It's very hard to do with astrology.
Yeah. And I think that's the point that you make, because you are a strong, obviously, supporter of science with your background. But what it seems like you're saying is it's not that method is not well equipped to deal with astrology or to study astrology. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Exactly. I think that astrology does not lend itself to reductionism. But then so do other things. And the category there are systems. One of the great points in my book, I think, is identifying the subject matter of astrology as systems, self-organizing systems in particular. And because system science is spread out among many disciplines, a lot of people don't know what it is. They hear, well, there's cybernetics, you know, the engineers are into that, you know, and then there's chaos and complexity, and the mathematicians and the physicists are into that. And then there's emergence, and the philosophers are into that. And then there's self-organizing systems.
So there's people in all these different silos that they're in, right?
Exactly. You know, academic apartheid is what James Lovelock called it. But
academic apartheid, okay.
Yeah, you have this phenomenon in nature that was really not so recognized until about 100 years or so ago, about roughly the same time as when quantum mechanics was getting going. Biologists started realizing that there was something distinctly different about life than from other things, you know, in nature. Life is like a cell or an organism. It's a self-organizing system, and it's composed of it contains self-organizing systems. You know, a cell is part of tissue, and tissue is part of an organ, and an organ is part of a body, and then the body is, you know, part of a collective, and part of an ecosphere. You know, part of the biosphere, which is subject to the solar system, right? So there's this nesting of systems that goes on, and systems are very difficult to measure with reductionist science. Now, this is really one of the key points of my book, is that if astrology is about measuring systems, and reductionist, materialist, mechanistic science is about, you know, has a great deal of difficulty measuring these systems, then, you know, we got to look at it that way. We got to realize that maybe we're using the wrong tools, or we're not using the tools in the right way to get at what astrology really is. And that's the big question. And what is astrology?
Because what you're saying is astrology should be considered a subject, like any other, like you said, with a history and a philosophy, and it should be, you know, if we had that institutional support for research and for, you know, study, because as you said, you know, 99% of it is practice. You know, as astrologers, we mainly is practice. That's what you did for many decades. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, if you like study astrology a lot, and you want to keep studying it, and you have all the pressures of living in our, you know, corporate capitalist society, like you have to be stressed all the time to survive, basically, right? So the only way you can make a living at astrology is to do readings. So that's what I did. I learned how to do readings and developed a business, and I used to do 4 readings a day, 5 days a week. And it was enough to, you know, survive on basically high school teacher's salary, I guess. I'm not much of a hustler. I have Mars and Libra conjunct Neptune. So, you know, I'm not out there, you know, driving my point home all the time. I basically made it on merit, I think.
That's interesting. I know only anecdotally, but I tend to see a lot of astrologers with Mars in Libra or Mars in Taurus, which is quite interesting. But again, I don't know.
Well, that's good for consulting. I mean,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know, you're polite.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Fantastic. So going back to your, you know, original study, so you were practicing for many decades. Now, I know this is a hypothetical, but if there was growing up institutional support, would you have seen yourselves more in research and theory rather than practice? If that was an option for you back in the day, did you enjoy your practice?
Yeah, I think that would be the case. You know, as you mentioned before about astrology as a subject, I've been arguing this for like 30 years that people were, you know, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, people were saying, well, is astrology an art or is it a science? And it dawned on me that, well, it's obviously a craft or an art of some sort when you're doing it, just like any kind of diagnostic work is. Doctors do this, you know, psychologists do this, right? But it's really a subject. It has a history, and the history has been developed quite a lot in the last couple decades. It has a category called theory, which few people pay any attention to. It has research, and there's probably also, we could say, philosophy. All that's really been developed in that category is rules of ethics, right, in astrology. I mean, these are things that the organizations try to promote, and the schools too.
That's a really important point, the term of ethics, because again, we're living in a world where astrology is not regulated. And I think I've heard you mention this before, but having to tighten up astrology. So what are your thoughts on certifications, places like KeplerCollege, where you have a real grounding in education in astrology? Because I think you've said this before again, right now it's a free-for-all with the internet. Anyone who, can read a book, and a week later they're out on YouTube, doing all these predictions and whatnot. So what are your general thoughts and points along those lines?
Well, if astrology is going to get anywhere, it has to have institutions, educational institutions, and it has to have some way of separating the clowns from the serious. Right now, astrology, for the most part, is basically you do it yourself. And so what the market selects for the people that are the most assertive and able to blow their horns louder. And if you're a good astrologer at the same time, then that's great. Then you get to some place and you say, see, I made it there, and this is how it should be. But there are a lot of people out there that don't have the capitalist hustling instinct or ability or a liking for it. So, and I think that merit is important, and some kind of certification system or some kind of educational system is needed in order to show that some people have made the effort to bring themselves up to speed with the subject and have a balanced view of it. I mean, I think that's a prerequisite for anything. And you know what? That's exactly how it is in every other subject. So who are we to say that we're a special case?
Of course. Like, I think you've said this before, if you want to be a doctor, a psychologist, whatever it may be, there's standards there. You can't just go out willy-nilly and say, I'm a doctor, I'm a psychologist, I think that education component is very important. And I myself, I'm continually learning. And I graduated from KeplerCollege, but I still feel, I look at the greats like yourself and other people, and I still feel that, well, there always is a lot more to learn, but I didn't even want to start practicing until I finished KeplerCollege. I didn't want to do 1 year like a freshman and then go out there and start dabbling with the public. I wanted to get a solid foundation education before I even attempted to work with other people or practice. So
that's good. That's admirable. So a lot of people, think they can go out and practice once they print up a business card.
Right.
It's crazy. So yeah, we have to have institutions, and they're developing now. I mean, I've been teaching for Kepler for quite a while, and I'm involved with PAA, the Professional Astrologers Alliance, which is a certification program that budded off from NCGR. It was part of NCGR. It was created by an NCGR education committee in 1979, and I was actually on it. I was young then. And Rob Hand was there, and probably about 50 people from around the country. We met at Princeton University and hammered out a 4-year curriculum for astrology to kind of match what would be in a college. And the program continued and began to offer certification exams in the 1990s, I guess, late 80s, 1990s. And it became a problem for NCGR because of tax purposes. And so it was budded off as a separate corporation maybe 10 years ago. And so I got involved with it again, and I've been trying to steer it in certain directions. We have online exams now. You can take exams on computers rather than paper. You can take them on paper if you want. We still have that. But we have online proctoring arrangements that can be made. We're trying to network. We always networked with Kepler and IAA and AFA, and we had equivalencies determined, but we're trying to extend that a bit and learn more about, or at least keep the equivalencies sharply and focused. So it's a start.
But at least these organized, there are places to go, and not as much as standardization, but at least go through rigorous training and take exams, which is very important.
Well, that's only in this country. I mean, there's quite a lot going on in the UK and Australia. But in this country, it's just developing. There have been exams for a long time. AFA had an exam for many, many years. I don't know that they've updated it, though.
Right, right. So talking about astrological organizations, how difficult, again, this is only anecdotal, but I think astrologers on the whole tend to be quite an independent bunch.
Oh, yeah.
So how difficult is it to get a group of independent-minded people to cohesively come together in groups and have a project? You know, is that been difficult in your experience? And what have you seen through your experience?
Well, it's like herding cats. You know, in astrology today, if you want to sustain your interest in astrology and make something from it, some income, maybe full time, you know, you have to be a very independent person. You are a sole proprietor. You have to file a Schedule C. You know, you have to maintain an office. You have to do a lot. It's a lot of work. And so this selects for pretty strong people that are able to make it on their own. So do they collaborate well with others? Not all the time. Probably the majority of them don't. Absolutely. I've been on astrological committees many times, and I've been on boards of organizations, and sometimes they cooperate, but largely there's you know, some strong disagreements that keep people arguing for entire meetings or more. It's difficult.
Yeah.
A lot of this is being invented. This hasn't really been done before. Astrology was not organized really until the last 30, 40 years or so. So in any kind of big way.
So what do you see for the future in terms of any institutional support? Do you think this will take decades, maybe centuries before it gets to a point where it's really pushed forward into because I mean, astrology now is tapping into the zeitgeist, but again, as you said, it's more of a free-for-all. You've got internet technology. I think some of it's great as a gateway into serious study, but you know, talking about institutional support, do you see that coming eventually? I mean, what are your thoughts around these issues?
Well, I think something like KeplerCollege it's a foundation. KeplerCollege could grow, and it could become a substantial institution at some point. That's entirely possible. I mean, these things happen. Great colleges and universities start with one building, have started with one building, and they develop and grow. So it could take decades. Yeah, it could take decades, I think. The certification, I think, is very important, though, because that's a shortcut towards some overall professional organization and credibility.
Yeah.
But the schools are the real institution. Certification is not really an institution. Libraries, you know, the Alexandria Library Project, you know, these are the institutions that, if they can survive for a few decades, will probably turn out to be foundational for the field of astrology.
Wonderful, wonderful. And this is really why we wanted to do this Leaders in Astrology series is, you know, can you imagine now from 50, 100 years from now, people reading your books and as well as other people we've had on, and to go back and look at the videos. I mean, imagine if you could go back and watch clips of William Lilly and the likes. So I think this is why we're doing this, but that's a very important point. So I'd like to circle back to your recent fantastic book, and you're talking about life organisms and systems. Now, I've been in one of your fantastic classes, and you talk about the Gaia theory. Does that kind of tie in with some of what you talk about in the book, or?
Yeah, you were in the astronomy class, right?
That's correct. Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I had a couple of weeks on astrobiology.
Yeah.
Right. Astrobiology, I think it's good for astrologers to know something about it. But when astrobiology was being put together as a subject, you know, it still is a subject that has no subject matter. Right? We don't have anything except life on Earth. We don't have any life from Mars to study.
Right.
So the astrobiologists are in a very funny position, but it's a subject. And in the early days, James Lovelock, and Lynn Margulis was also involved as well with him, put out this Gaia hypothesis, the idea that life has properties, self-organizing properties that help to modulate the environment in such a way that the environment then becomes self-sustaining for life. So it's again this self-organization thing, but astrobiology is today a very popular topic, and you see it. Scientists are devoted to it, and they're searching for life in the oceans and beneath the surface in Europa and some of these other moons and Mars. Everything's driven towards finding some life. I hope with Pluto and Aquarius we actually find some life out there.
I really hope so too.
Yeah, but yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question. There was this.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I'm kind of going off topic, but it's going back to when you were talking about the Sun Saturn opposition, talking about weather. But then there's a longer time span if we're talking over millennia with climate. So right now, obviously, we've got the climate emergency, and of course, obviously, half the population don't believe it's even real that the climate is changing. But life on Earth as we know it. How do you see this longer time span, and is the planetary involvement with it? And also, what's going to happen, do you think, to what's going on now with climate change and what's happening right now? I don't know if that makes sense.
It doesn't look good. And yeah. I can relate it to some of my ideas that I've talked about for many years, that the failure to deal with the climate emergency, which is, I like to use that term, or global heating. I think climate change is too benign.
Right.
But in any case, it's a problem that requires a holistic solution, because we're dealing with a self-organizing system, the climate system. Climate is not weather. Weather is short-term, climate is long-term. So if you're thinking like a climatologist, you're thinking in terms of tens of thousands of years, millions of years even. But it is something that is constantly changing and stabilizing itself in various ways. So because we're so reductionist in our thinking, it's been hard to really wrap a lot of people in positions of power, it's been hard for them to wrap their minds around the climate problem. They're getting a pie in the face right now with everything that's going on. It's getting really bad. And from what I know, this can't be corrected very quickly. I think that what's happened now is like we've crossed a line.
The tipping point.
Yeah. And there's the thing about the biosphere, or as Lovelock and Margulis call it, Gaia, right? The idea that the surface of the Earth with the organisms and the atmosphere and the oceans and the soils are a coupled self-organizing system, and they reach a stability point, homeostasis. It's like a thermostat set at 70. Well, what happens, it turns out that if you go back into paleoclimatology, you look back into the past climate-wise, and you see that there were these different climate regimes that would remain stable for a long time, and then they would change. So, for example, when the dinosaurs were around, there was no ice on the poles, and there was a lot less land because the oceans were 300 feet higher. It flooded the whole central part of the United States. So so what it is that the Earth itself, as a self-organizing system, is not homeostatic, it's homoeretic. Homeoresis is the term. And that means that the system, when it reaches an unstable point, jumps to another setting and then locks onto that. So in terms of a thermostat, we've had it set for 70, and something goes wrong. Somebody throws the power off, or somebody messes something up, and then it gets reset at 78. And then it locks in, it stays at 78. So what I'm getting at is that I don't think we're going to be able to turn back to where we've been.
Right.
It's going to get set somewhere else. And then we have these very slow orbital changes that are going on that vary the amount of sunlight that hits the Earth, solar radiation. And the cycle that the Earth has been entrained to for the last 700,000 years is 100,000-year cycle, the cycle of the shape of the Earth's orbit, the ellipticity, how elliptical the Earth's orbit is. And if all things were holding as they have been, then we're slowly drifting into a cooling. And about 50,000 years from now, we should be beginning to enter an ice age. But who knows what's going to go on now? I mean, we have disrupted the climate system, and we could shoot it into some other place where it's no longer following the 100,000-year cycle, and it's following the cycle of precession or the cycle of obliquity.
So in the short term, and I know you alluded to before, of Pluto ingress into Aquarius, do you think over the next 20 years, do you think any technologies that we improve might have, have we just gone too far? Do you think anything that we can do can improve technology-wise? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm a skeptic on that.
Okay.
Or at best, ambivalent. It's possible that there could be a technological solution to this problem, but if you look back in terms of history of science and history of society, there's for a long time been this idea that all our problems could be solved with technology, that there's always a technological problem to a technological solution to a technological problem. Even some people think that that's going to reach a stalemate at some point. And I think that I think that it has a lot to do with our attitudes and our behaviors as a species. We're so anthropocentric. We're so in love with ourselves as a species. We can't think of anything else. You know, it's like geocentrism, but it's, you know, species wide. It's all about us. We are just reaching the point where it's becoming apparent that we're not the only passengers on this planet, and that we actually rely on other passengers on this planet, including bacteria. For example, the microbiome in us and in other animals is so crucial, not only to our digestive tract, but also to our moods and stability. We are harboring all these microbes that have their own agendas going on. You know, we are multitudes, as Whitman said.
It's
and
interesting.
This is a hard thing for self-absorbed Homo sapiens to really accept. And yet it is necessary to accept in order for us to move forward. And so therefore, maybe a technological solution to all the technological problems that have caused climate change is not going to do it in its entirety. We have to have an attitude change.
I like that point, an attitude change. I think that's a very important point. And it's interesting before, because you were talking about exoplanets, and maybe, you know, hopefully in the next 20 years, we may be able to find life elsewhere. But it's interesting if you take Pluto further back, when Pluto ingressed into, you had Copernicus's heliocentric model of the solar system. So talking about being self-absorbed, it was the attack of the church at that time, wasn't it? When he was saying, you know, the Earth is not the center of the solar system, the center of the universe, in the time when Pluto was in Aquarius. So do you think maybe as Pluto ingresses into Aquarius for the next 20 years, that we'll find life on other planets? I mean, what are your thoughts? Well,
it could be. You know, you pointed out the correlation. If you go back in history, when Pluto's in Aquarius, lots of very important things happen. You had the U.S. Constitution. You know, right now, what is I looking at? 1777 or 78, I think, somewhere around there, Pluto had gone into Aquarius. And you had the American Revolution raging, you know, and that led to a whole new definition of how governments could operate. You know, climaxing with the Constitutional Convention was 1787. So that was Pluto.
They gave us the middle finger and said, down with the monarchies, where it's the people. Aquarius,
that's right.
The people.
Exactly, yeah. So I think that, you know, we're at a point where there's going to be some, I think, radical breakthroughs, but we're also at a point where there are too many people. There really are. If everybody's going to live like a middle-class American, and that's actually probably a lower middle-class American, we're going to need 4 or 5 Earths. or we're going to have some real clever technological solutions to these problems. And I don't have 100% faith that technology is going to solve all our problems, as I pointed out before.
So that's quite an interesting point, because I think, what have we just tipped over? What billion mark of the population? But it's been fairly recent. So talking about overpopulation, so Pluto ingressing into Aquarius, I know there's some forms of technology they're talking about vertical farms and things like that. But the point you're making, it seems, is this: if we continue at this rate, we're not going to have the resources to sustain everybody's life on this planet. What did you say? 3 or 4 Earths? Is that what they're saying?
Yeah, maybe 4 or 5 even.
4.
If everyone's going to live like we do,
right?
And right now they don't. I mean, there's a lot of poor people, and of course, climate change is forcing migration, and people don't like migration because we're basically tribal. People don't understand that our emotions and responses and reactions are the same as what people had 20,000 years ago. And back then, you lived in small groups, maybe extended families of about 30 or so, and you suspected everyone else that was coming around because they might bring with them some disease, or they might kill you while you're sleeping. So there's this great fear of people that you don't know. And climate change is forcing that in everyone's face.
It really is. It really is. And interestingly, I think we're going to get to a point where certainly the scarcity of resources, it will turn, instead of oil wars, maybe we'll turn to water wars. And as we've talked about before, you had back when Pluto ingressed into Aquarius, the American Revolution, I think you had the French Revolution in there, about 16, 70 degrees of Aquarius as well. So it'd be interesting. Do you see anything astrologically indicating turbulent times coming up, or do you think we're constantly in turbulent times, politically and otherwise?
Yeah, I think that you have astrological aspects that are going to indicate turbulence. For example, Uranus-Pluto aspects, that sort of thing, which we had, fairly recently. But when you have the potential for more trouble, even minor aspects will trigger an event. Now, for example, one of the things that I've done throughout my life is observe the rising and setting of planets and the transits and so on, as they play out in groups of people. Now, there's this rule in statistics that when you get over 30, you start getting more accurate readings. You have to have like a certain number of people in one place, to begin to sort out information in any kind of reliable statistical way. At law of large numbers, in a sense. And then in biology, you have this idea of quorum sensing, that if you get, say, a group of microorganisms, when they get to 1,000 or 1,000,000 or something like that, then they start to operate collectively in some ways. There's a switch that's thrown. And one of the things I've found is that by playing in bands, you're there for 4 hours. And years ago, I had a watch that I bought, and it had a speed adjustment in it, a pocket watch, and I moved it so it went 4 minutes faster in a day. And then I could track sidereal time with that. And then I got an astronomer's watch when they came out, digital astronomer's watch. But I would notice that there were very few people in the room, not a lot would happen. Say Uranus would culminate, and not a lot would happen. Maybe 2 people would get up and leave, or somebody might drop a dish. But if you had 100 people or more in the room, you could really see a wave of energy, that people were responding to these effects in some ways. But what I'm getting at is that if you have a high population like we have on the planet, even minor aspects are going to trigger developments. We're not all spread out now. We're all concentrated in cities, and we have supply problems, and one war in Eastern Europe causes all sorts of food chain disruptions. We're so interconnected that even minor things could prove very disruptive.
That's
So
really
I think we're in
interesting.
a turbulent area in general, and yes, the planets are going to trigger these kinds of things, but it will take fewer and fewer complex planetary configurations to produce big events than ever before.
Now, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think I've heard you talk about gravity's effect. Now, I think you talked about Saturn compared to the moon, that Saturn is there is an effect, but it's so minuscule compared to the moon and the gravity. Can you maybe expand on that point? I thought it was quite interesting.
Yeah, in the study that I did that I report in the book, I have a paper on it, was in Correlation at 10 or some years ago. I pointed out that the gravitational effect of Saturn on the Earth's atmosphere, a rough back of the envelope calculation, is about 4 orders of magnitude less than that of the sun. The moon's a little bit stronger, but it's very minuscule. And yet an effect was determined. You know, you see these cool downs in temperature in certain regions of the Earth, not everywhere, obviously. So gravity as a factor in astrology, there may be something to it, maybe with planets. Whether it has to do with people, I don't know. We have the electromagnetic force, and then there's the two, small and large force, among atoms. But we're at the present time in physics explaining the world in terms of 4 primary forces, and the only ones that seem possibly relevant to astrology would be gravity and electromagnetism. I don't know if that explains everything. I think I'm pretty clear in the book that I think we're better off trying to explain what we can rather than throwing our hands up in the air and say it can't be explained.
Right.
But there's a lot in astrology that's pretty strange, and I'm not going to say that it isn't, and that the explanations are there. I will say that I think any explanations in astrology, whether they involve one force or the other, are probably going to be pretty similar because the weather system reacts to the same kinds of planetary configurations as people do, both being self-organizing systems. That's why astrometeorologists will cast charts for ingresses and read them almost like a birth chart. So there's a similarity, a continuity across dimensions, in a sense, with the astrological vocabulary. So whether there has to be the same force in all cases, I'm not so sure.
So it may be a case that we're just not there yet in terms of being able to understand what's really going on, because like you say, astrology is so incredible. If you follow your own lunar cycles or solar cycles, whatever it might be, there's just no doubt that it, in quotes, works. It's just coming down to the bottom of how is the big question.
Yeah. Well, there was that in my book. I talk about biologists, and I mentioned this guy Frank Brown, who worked on circadian rhythms. And towards the end of his life, he was working on. Well, he lost a lot of his funding because he was criticized. By the way, he wrote the introduction to Gauquelin's first, one of his books, the second book, Cosmic Clocks. And so, not that he was specifically a supporter of astrology, but he didn't dismiss astrology. Let's put it that way. And just by not dismissing it, he was, criticized severely, and he wound up with a lot less funding. And so he started doing work on potatoes and sticking electrodes in them and watching what kinds of rhythms they had because they're living, and found out that they were responding to all sorts of strange things: solar radiation and hydrostatic pressure, air pressure, all sorts of things. And he was going off in that direction. And there's a few people doing it now, but it was not a popular direction for a long time. So it may be that there are a lot of factors in our environment that can be explained with our current physical knowledge, but they're not recognized probably because they're so small and minute. But when you're dealing with systems, this is a class of nature, whether it's a cell or the climate system or the emergent person, mental activity of a person, or the emergent activity of a lot of people, like the stock market, which you can put numbers on, right? Right? The responses to very small bits of energy or very small pieces of measurable information,
right,
is apparent. It's like Lorenz, the meteorologist, who said a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil could cause a tornado in Texas a few days later, right? A very small, it's the idea that at these initial moments, the difference between initial moments is really quite great. I think a lot of these ideas, this isn't chaos theory, a lot of these ideas are applicable to astrology, especially the fact that we use charts for most of our work. Most people think astrology is a birth chart, but it's more than that. You can have graphs and you can look at cycles and so on. But the birth chart is essentially a time slice. It's an initial moment.
And that's what and I think that's a great framing as a time slice. I think that's fantastic. And actually
that's used in geosciences, by the way. That's, I think, where I got it.
Oh, is that right? So actually, because talking about your academic background, because you have I think you have 3 degrees altogether. You've got your PhD, your master's.
Yeah, I got a BA, a master's, and a PhD.
So it's quite interesting in academic circles, and you're referring to somebody else before. Is it the case? This is probably the wrong terminology nowadays, but is it kind of being like in the closet for a lot of people, that people find out in academic circles that someone's an astrologer or studies cycles? I mean, how's that experience been in academic circles? Is that still a real bias against even mentioning astrology? Or
well, you could study chronobiology. I took a seminar in chronobiology, a weekly seminar for a semester, and there were a lot of engineers in it and a lot of biologists, and they were really interested in phase shifting of circadian rhythms. It's pretty sophisticated stuff, and I found it fascinating. Especially with plants. Plants can do all sorts of things by picking up on light levels and periods of darkness and light, and how the phases can be reset. There is a bit of a mechanism in there. So that's okay. You could talk about that. In geosciences, you could talk about Milankovitch cycles, also known as orbital cycles, which have very strong correlations with ice ages and climate changes. And for example, the Mediterranean has dried out about 25 or 30 times in rhythms that match the cycle of precession.
Wow.
I didn't know that until I, started studying geoscience, and I said, "Whoa, this is really something." The climate system was entrained, at least in that part of the world, by that cycle. And you could talk about that, and you can take it a step further, and some people do. There's a guy at Brown that does it. You can talk about how the gravitational effects of the planets on the Earth's orbit create these orbital changes, which then correlate with climate changes. So you can see the effect of Mars on the Earth's orbit over long periods of time, and they've even gone back to about, I think, 200 million years ago. Lake levels, show a pattern that correlates with the shape of the Earth's orbit and the cycle of Mars. Resonances between orbits. So you can talk about those things in geoscience. There are a few people doing it, and there was a guy named Rhodes Fairbridge, who was very interested in solar system dynamics on climate. He was from Columbia. So it's there. You just don't use the word astrology. You have to be careful with that.
Some of the problem is gathering data sets. So I think when you talked about before the Sun Saturn oppositions, but I think you said the recordings only went back to the mid 1700s. So you only had a couple of 100 years of once a year data. So Is data a problem, or the gathering of accurate recordings?
Yes. Well, if you're going to do, reductionist science, you need units.
Right, right.
And you need a lot of them. So in my case, I was studying Sun-Saturn oppositions, which occur once every 378 days. So roughly, once a year. So most data sets in the United States go back maybe at the most 100 years or 150 years. And in England, you have central England temperature that goes back to the, I think, 1772. And then you have a similar data set in Prague, Austria, that goes back about that far. And I got a hold of those data sets and worked with them. But one of the things I found was that, yes, there was a change, a lowering of temperature around the date of a Sun-Saturn opposition. So let's suppose I have a 100-year data set. So I have 100 pieces of data there and I measure them. Yes, there's a dip and it goes down, somewhat. Then I take the ones that also involved a lunation. So that would mean that the moon was involved as well. We have Sun and Saturn involved. So if we have a new moon or a full moon, I took those. So out of that data set, it came down to maybe 15. And now you've got an even bigger dip. You've got and it's now statistically significant, but your data set is 15, n equals 15. And people in science go, come on, that's not enough. But then if you look at the ones that are near the equinoxes, which means that the declination is low, you wind up with a data set of 4. And it's extreme. It's like way down, but a data set of 4 is, now we're talking, it's almost ridiculous. You can't really make a statement on that. But if I had 1,000-year data set,
right,
10 times longer, I would have at least 40.
Absolutely.
So that's the problem. If you don't have the data, you can't do the work, and you can't show that the statistics are solid. But I think what I've shown is that when you start reducing the results that you have to things like a Sun-Saturn opposition with the moon at the equinox, you get something that's really quite striking.
Fascinating. And so interesting. Actually, it makes me think of, if we can find a financial astrologer who becomes a billionaire and can invest into research and study for astrology, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, but you still can't get the data beyond.
Right, well, that's true. Yeah, the data's not there. The data's not there. Yeah.
You can do it on a yearly basis. One of the things that the climate scientists do is reconstruct past weather, but to resolve it to the yearly level is very tough. They talk about things like decadal resolution. So if you take an ice core from Greenland or Antarctica and you start looking at it, you might have decadal resolution.
Wow.
Or maybe even century resolution. But to get it to the day, it's hard.
Fascinating.
You have to have instruments. You have to have instruments. And instrumentation only came about in the late 17th century.
Yeah. That's such a fascinating point. And actually, I want to move to some of your work you've done in archaeology and Mesoamerican studies. So can you explain a bit more about that background and how you got involved and what that was about?
Well, it all goes back to my interest in trying to figure out what astrology is. I'm coming out of as a young kid, I was trained in science, or I thought I used that was my knowledge base. And so astrology was like, whoa, something very different, very strange. How do you explain it? And the astrologers weren't explaining it. I don't think most astrologers are that interested in theory. They just want to do what they're doing, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I wanted to know more about it. And
is it kind of like looking at the clock and saying, well, I know it works, but how does it work type of deal?
Yeah.
What's the mechanic? Yeah.
So I messed up my lower back when I was about 28, on my first Saturn return.
Oh.
And I had to have back surgery. And so here I am in the hospital, and I brought a book with me, The Conquest of Mexico by Bernal Diaz del Castillo. So I'm reading this, and they get to the, they're in the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan, and they're talking about the Aztec astrologers. And I said, what? So this is in the 1970s. So I started looking into Aztec astrology. And then I had also had a book in a course that I took on non-Western civilization, and it was a book by Jacques Soustelle called Daily Life of the Aztecs. And I got a hold of that somehow too. From the class, the combination of those two books put me over the top, and I had to find out about Aztec astrology. So I started reading about it, and then I started going down there, and I learned about the Maya and the whole history of Mesoamerica. And they had an astrological system. It hadn't gotten to the point where you had individual charts per se, but you had listings, and they would put up these markers that would contain a lot of information, very much like the very early Greek charts there, where they would list the planetary positions and the horoscope, which is the ascendant. I'm trying to not use the word horoscope for a birth chart for two reasons. One is that I don't think it's quite accurate. I think if you look at
talking about the hour,
it's a view of the
slice
hour,
that you talked about.
Yeah, the horoscope is the ascendant. It's the hour marker,
right?
The view of the hour, but people start calling it that. So I think that to be more accurate, it's probably better to just use birth chart and use horoscope for the ascendant. And the other reason is that
I like your word time slice as well. I think I'm going to use that more often.
yeah. Well, and the other one is that I think the term has been abused terribly, and it's got a bad reputation. So you say the word horoscope, and it conjures up these images of a newspaper column, and next to the funny pages, so probably not a good idea. So time slice,
connotations connected with it, I think. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. So in ancient Mesoamerica, you had these stelae, or these stone markers, and they would list where the moon was and where it was in its phases, and where Venus might be, and where the date in terms of these other cycles that related to Jupiter and Saturn. And so I saw that as very similar to what was going on. I dug into it more and more, and I continued to be interested in it, but I did some writing on it. There was a cycle of 20 days, each one having a sign, a day sign, in a sense, that is crucial to understanding the system. And it's like a zodiac. It's very interesting. And this meshes in with a few other cycles, including planetary cycles, producing a master cycle of 260 days.
Wow.
So 260 days turns out to be the appearance interval of Venus, either a day sign, morning star, or evening star. It has to do with the cycle of Mars, synodic cycle of Mars with the sun. It has to do with Mercury. It incorporates the moon. They're all incorporated into it, sort of like a lowest common denominator. And it was used for multiple purposes, largely social, but some personal. When you were born, you got a name that was your day sign.
Oh.
And there are different levels to it. There's also a 13-day cycle. So there's quite a lot going on in Mesoamerican astrology.
And forgive me if I'm wrong, but did they spend a lot of time, I think, with Venus? Was it not a harbinger of war, or am I incorrect?
Yeah. Venus, as a morning star, was regarded as a dangerous, unstable phase. So right when it went into conjunction with the sun, that would be inferior conjunction.
Right.
So when Venus is between the Earth and the sun. From that point on, it was associated with risky behaviors and not looked on favorably. In fact, the Aztecs would, close their windows and, cover their chimney at the time, because they thought people would be struck down. And I've followed this, and there does seem to be something to it. I got interested in this idea that the solar wind, is blowing on Venus, and it's blowing Venus's atmosphere off. Venus has a very thick, complex, thick atmosphere of sulfur and other things. And some people have speculated that life exists in the Venusian atmosphere because the surface is just too hot. But when you're at a Venus inferior conjunction, Venus is between the Earth and the Sun, and so parts of Venus's atmosphere are being blown right to the Earth. And there have been some studies that have shown that following one of these blasts, all sorts of incidences of flus and other kinds of illnesses go up. Maybe other things go up as well. But I got intrigued by that idea, and I looked at the Aztecs and the Maya being obsessed with this particular phase of the Venus cycle, and I thought there might be a physical basis to it. Again, this is speculation, just kind of an interest on my part that I might want to get into at some point if I have any more time.
That's fascinating. Did you ever do any digs, any archaeology in some of these places?
No, not really. I went to a lot of the sites. I like them. I like the ruins. I was just down in Mexico in February for dental work. I got a couple implants, 3 implants there. Good price, nice place. But I was right near some Mayan temples that people weren't paying too much attention to. They were just there, and every day I would walk out to them and hang out, and there were quite a few iguanas guarding the territory. I like it. I like being around those old ruins. It's kind of a Hadean thing, I have a strong Hades.
And you mentioned the Hades as well. So have you done quite a bit of work in Uranian astrology?
Yeah. I met Gary Kristen back in the 70s at Rutgers, and he knew Hans Nigemann, who was from Germany and was one of the students, Alfred Witt's students. And there were a few others, Wayne Boer and a few other people that were studying at the time, and we got together. I used to go into New York from New Jersey and meet up and learn about all these things and try out all these planets. And I think that there's definitely something to them. I'm not sure exactly what it is again, but Hades is a point that basically its orbit would be in the Kuiper belt if it exists. So it's probably a little bit beyond Pluto. And it seems to have qualities of Saturn and the moon. And some people have argued that what it really is some kind of complex multiple orbital factor that moves very slowly. But Witt gave the description of it with retrogradation as well. It seems to work fairly well. I happen to have it square my sun. So I've been interested in archaeology all my life, and I live and work in basements all the time. And, I like ruins. I did some cave exploration. I was a spelunker for a while.
Oh, wow. Yeah. But that was an experience.
Yeah. In New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, there were some caves there. Some of them were quite big.
Also, even closer to home. That's great.
You get dirty, though. You get really, really dirty.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine my background. My grandmother's father, he was a miner. Well, he was in the First World War, but then he was a miner. He was very short. But I'm too claustrophobic for getting too much into the depth. So talking about your, again, incredible body of work over time, is there an accomplishment that you're most proud of per se? Or is it just for you the collective work? I mean, what are you most?
Well, the whole thing has really been a process. I've been interested in answering the question, what is astrology? So this last book that I have out kind of really grabs it. I get at it, more directly in that book than anything else. I have a few other projects, one of which is the Mesoamerican Astrology that was very central for me in the 80s and the early 90s. And then around 2012, when it became more popular again, I got back into it and wrote a few papers and some books and did some talks on it. So there was a little bit of a revival there, but I haven't done too much with it lately. I have this other idea that I call the developmental imprint Developmental planetary imprint hypothesis, right? So that's the idea. I wrote a book on it, wrote an article on it, several articles. I started this in the 80s. I think the first time I published on it was 1987. And I have a book on it that was published in 2000 called The Circuitry of the Self. And what I argue is that the stages of development, of human development, have an uncanny similarity to the moon, Mars, Mercury, and Venus in that order. And I try to explain that in terms of humans as organisms being sensitive to light changes, photo period, that is the length of day versus length of night. And that there's a recognition of one's birthday because of that, because the ratio of night and day is the same on your birthday or close to it. So there we have solar returns,
right,
in astrology that are considered significant, and this is when the light day night ratio goes back to where it was when you're born. So I'm looking at that as a trigger of some sort. And then I'm looking at, well, what other kinds of cycle returns happen? Well, if you look at, the most obvious one is probably Venus. When you're 8 and on your birthday, it's also your Venus return. The same thing happens at 16 and every 8 years, but it falls out. It becomes less exact, but it's very strong at 8 and then at 16. And you have at age 2, your Mars return is within a month or 2 of your birthday. And there are connections with Mercury and there are connections with the moon. And so I tried to show that at certain birthdays, there were these planetary connections which correlated with the developmental stage that the person would be going through. Like the first couple of years is moon. It's a lunar stage. It's biosurvival. It's attachment. It's nurturing. It's the mother, It's then between 2 and 4, you have this emotional territorial stage where you're fighting terrible twos. Right? So this is when Mars is returning. You're declaring your independence and you're learning how to control your muscles, toilet training. Mercury slips in at 3.5 and again at 13 for various reasons, which you'd have to, I'd rather not go into now, but there are strong planetary correlations. And then Venus. So you develop, this biosurvival period, this independence period, emotional territorial, then there's this learning period, and then there's this socio-sexual period associated with Venus. And so I've been developing that. And what I say about it is, of course, it doesn't explain everything in astrology, but it's an interesting correlation that I've observed. So you have not only these psychologists independently coming up with these models, they all differ a little bit, but there's a general consensus. Right. And how they match those inner planets really well. And there's an astronomy, there's a planetary orbital synchronicity with these periods. So that's what I'm pointing towards. I would love to study it more and do some studies, but I need a database and I don't have it.
Right. Because I would say if that you produce that into it, but I'd love to read some of that. That sounds so fascinating. And like you said, these are the psychologists. They've already been putting these models together, and you're just showing the planetary effects. Yeah,
I did write a paper on it. It was never published.
Oh,
because I haven't tried to get it published, but I put it up on academiaedu.edu, and I have some of my more serious scientific type papers up there.
Fantastic. And can you repeat that as well so we can?
Yeah, academia.edu.
Academia.edu. Okay.
Yeah, just look up my name, and then I have probably about 10 papers up there, scientific papers. One of them is called the Developmental Planetary Imprint Hypothesis.
Fascinating.
So this is a project that I started a long time ago that I could keep going with it, but how much time is there?
Right, right, yeah. Like I say, this is why I love doing these interviews, because talking about the standing on the shoulders of giants. I was born in 1987, so it just shows how the great amount of work you've done over time, which is
What's your birthday?
February 6,
Okay, yeah.
1987.
I have a son born in 1987.
Oh, is that right? Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, yeah. And so yeah, just looking up to the leaders in astrology, and this is why I love doing these interviews. And again, to look back on, just to share your experiences and wisdom, which is absolutely fascinating. These next questions, and again for Kepler College, what classes are you teaching right now? You're still doing the astronomy? Is that
Yeah,
correct?
I've been doing the astronomy for a while. I like it. I want to go into it and revamp it, but it's set up in a way that it's pretty much still up to date. I add things periodically. I have a section that you'll probably remember on comets.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And whenever there's a comet probe up there going on, I'll add it to the reading list and maybe get a little, bring it into the discussions, the forums there. But the astronomy classes, as you know, it's not in person. It's you take it at your own speed, and I interact as much as I can. And some people get into it, some people don't. But I also have a course on Mesoamerican astrology. Some people take that. And one on Uranian astrology, but I call it symmetry in astrology.
Symmetry.
I emphasize the idea that symmetry is a major component of astrology. You see it with things like the lots, part of fortune. You see it with Anticia. You see it just in the arrangement of the zodiac. There's a lot of power to symmetry in astrology, and with Uranian astrology, this idea of symmetry is just brought to a climax of some sort. It's a way of doing astrology that's so different from traditional astrology that it could stand on its own.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It doesn't really use the zodiac.
Yeah, yeah, fascinating. I'd love to. I need to take that symmetry course, because your classes are absolutely fantastic. So for our viewers, I'm going to put the links plural of all the classes that you do at Kepler in the description in this box. So those are the classes you're doing right now. Have you got any more in the works, or is this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those three, by the way, are take as you go.
Right.
I haven't done any live classes for a while. And I like it to take it as you go. It works good for me.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
And it works good for other people. Some people take a year to do it. I let them do that. I say 6 months, and I'll let them slide for a year.
Fantastic, fantastic. And actually, going back a little bit, how did you become involved with Kepler? Were you one of the people at the beginnings, or did you come on later on and get onboarded? Or
yeah, they wanted somebody to teach chart calculations, and I got drawn into it. So I was there in 2001. I think I was in the second year, and then I started working with Georgia Stathis, and we taught transits, progressions, and solar arcs for a few years, and I liked it. We, you'd go out there 3 times a year. We had a symposium, stay for a week, and the students were great. And you're in a place where you can go out and eat different restaurants. We were in Seattle, and actually we were in Seattle the first time I went there. We were at Seattle University.
Oh wow!
In the summer, and then we wound up going south to. I can't think of the name of the town there, but it's near the airport. It's where Boeing is based. And then we were at some other kind of. It moved around, but it was great to be in person. And then we would do all the online stuff.
It was funny. I just finished an interview with Michael Luton, and he said that you were an alien Elvis at one point at one of the conferences. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Mike would write these plays. He wrote some great plays. I was Nostradamus's girlfriend. That was the first one. He found out that I was in music, so I went in. I was part of I was a monk or something in that one, and then he had one called Alien Follies, and he dressed me up as Elvis, and I went on with an electric guitar and played a rock tune in it, and no one recognized me. I remember that.
This is only anecdotal as well, but I found with a lot of astrologers I know is their deep appreciation for music, whether it's classical, whether it's rock. So do you see whether it's, the harmonics or frequencies, whatever it might be. Why do you think that is, the appreciation of music and that tie into astrology? I don't know if that question makes sense, but what are your thoughts?
It makes a lot of sense. I think that if you're going to do astrology, you have to be able to synthesize information. You just can't follow a rule book. I mean, you could start that way, but I think that people who have experience with the arts have a step up in this. They're able to enter this world a lot easier. And almost every really good astrologer that I know has some kind of artistic side as well.
Yeah.
And music seems to be a common one, because music relates a little bit more to mathematics. But yeah, I've been in music. I was interested in music from the time I started listening to the radio when I was probably 5 years old. And when I was about 7 or 8, you started hearing things like, probably about 8, I would say. So that was in 1956, and my mother would have the radio on. I started hearing Elvis, and then a few years after that, Jerry Lee Lewis, and all this early rock and roll, and my head exploded. This was the best stuff I ever heard in my life.
And you were more interested in what, electric guitar, or did you play acoustic?
Yeah, I play electric guitar. I've played bass in bands too. Right now I'm playing bass for a Boston band, like part-time whenever they need somebody.
Fantastic. What kind of music is it? You say rock and roll?
Well, this guy, the name of the band is Deep Sea Divers. It's a guy, Deep Chinapa is his name, and he writes his own stuff, and it's a really good all original kind of work. But mostly I've played in bar bands and cover bands. I've played a lot of acoustic, but in the last 20 years, it's mostly been bar bands, American Legions and VFWs. And so it's a lot of 60s rock and roll, Rolling Stones, ZZ Top, stuff like that.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
mine's a little heavy. I'm more the Black Sabbath, Slayer stuff, but I do love music.
We were playing Paranoid for a while.
Oh, I'd love that. I'd be there.
But you know what? I like it too. The drummer and I like it, but the other two guys never heard of it, and they didn't like it.
Not interested.
No, so it got dropped. But I like playing it.
Well,
yeah, I like all kinds of rock. Right today, this morning I was listening to Velvet Underground.
Oh, Velvet Underground, is that with? No, not Slash? Was he involved in that band? No, Velvet.
No. Velvet Underground is what's his name? Brain just ain't working as fast as usual. It'll come to me in a moment. But
yeah, because I'm thinking of Velvet, not Underground, Velvet Revolver. Anyway, I'm thinking of
this is a '60s band.
Oh, okay. Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, but I started on trumpet in high school, and I played in the concert band, the marching band, and the dance band. I played trombone in the dance band.
Wow.
And I learned how to read music, and I still like a lot of different kinds of music. I like I like jazz, some jazz I don't like, but a lot of it I do. I like American roots music. I like some classical. I have a great appreciation for all kinds of music.
It's interesting. So, I mean, I don't know a lot about music, but take, for example, we take aspects, harmonious or disharmony, in the chords that people play, the type of music. I mean, do you think that kind of resonates with astrologers maybe?
Yeah, well, that's what Kepler thought. Kepler saw the aspects as harmonics.
Right.
And he related astrology to music to astronomy. And Kepler came up with a theory of everything. And it's the harmonics of the world. It's the name of his book. And he had an earlier version of it called The Mysterious Cosmos. So yeah, the connection between music aspects, in particular phase and harmonics and music, is very apparent.
Yeah,
it's deeply embedded, in both subjects.
And you touched on an important point before, which is synthesis. So you might have students or people, they might understand the signs, the planets, houses, the element of dignity and debility, things like that. But when they get into the point of trying to synthesize the information, sometimes that's the leap that people have to take. So do you think people who maybe struggle with astrology, do you think some people may have a problem with ambiguity, maybe, if they're very black and white thinkers? Again, I don't know if that question makes sense either, but
Yeah, I think so. I have some friends in science that they just don't get it because
yeah,
they think atomistically. They just can't get it at all.
yeah.
But I just wanted to jump back. Of course, it jumped in my mind. Velvet Underground, Lou Reed.
Oh, that okay. That now that rings a bell, right?
Yeah. I mean, as I get older, it's what if I'm focused on something, I'm okay, but it's a lot of all the other stuff. I think what happens is the hard drive gets filled up.
Is that what?
Yeah, the
After all
hard
the
drive in my
decades.
brain is like it's overflowing. It's a big mess. But and while we were on music, I wanted to mention a couple things that if people haven't taken a listen to Gustav Holst's The Planet Symphony, they should, because Holst was an English composer, and he wrote this is before Pluto, so there isn't a Pluto one, but it goes out to Neptune, and he knew something about astrology, and the compositions are just brilliant.
Wow.
Orchestras will often play, guess what? Jupiter. They like Jupiter. Mars sometimes gets played. Mars has been used as the soundtrack for a lot of science fiction films. But the Saturn is fabulous. Holst thought that his Saturn composition was his best.
Wow.
So this is there's a lot of versions of it. A lot of orchestras have played it. Even Kataro has a version. I think Kataro does, or somebody.
Fascinating.
But that's always great to listen to if you're into astrology and music. And the other one is when the Moog synthesizer was developed, I think one of the first, if not the first recording was called Cosmic Sounds of the Zodiac. And some guy played, synthesizer, and a poet whose name escapes me right now wrote simple poetry to it. But that's another really great piece of music I love. Back in the 60s, I was just crazy about it. And I bought the CD some years ago, and I pull it out now and then and play it. It's hilarious in a way. It's very funny. Like 9 times the color red explodes like heated blood. The battle is on. That's Aries, right?
Right. I'd enjoy that. What some of the names again, just to remind us?
Well, The Planet Symphony by Gustav Holst.
Gustav Holst?
Holst, Holst. I think it's a German name, but he was an English composer. Very well known. When I was in the high school band, we played a thing called Second Suite in F by him. It was a trumpet piece, and I played trumpet, and I really liked it. I said, wow, this guy's a great composer.
Yeah.
And then I found out, a few years later that he did the planets, and I was sold.
Wow.
And the other one is Cosmic Sounds of the Zodiac. It's out as a CD.
Oh, wow. Cosmic Sounds of the Zodiac?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was originally in the 60s as an LP, but I can't think of the composer right now. Right.
It's another one will pop in when you get rid of some of the hard drive issues.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Fascinating. So the last couple of questions we've got for you. So what advice would you give, say, my generation and generations coming up as they progress and go into the field? I know maybe not specifically the practice of astrology. If anyone was interested in research or theory, I mean, what advice would you give future generations?
Well, I think it's always important to educate yourself in things other than astrology. I think that astrologers would do well to know a little more science. I mean, that's what I try to get across in the astronomy class. Get a little more familiar with subjects that are related to astrology, like astronomy and astrology. History is very important. Just understand how those subject areas work and how they've gotten to where they are today. And I think that alone should stimulate people to make astrology a better subject, to move it forward. I don't think it's going away. Astrology is going to be here, but I think it can be vastly improved. Astrology attracts a wide range of people. And I think that's a good thing. It gives it a lot of diversity. So maybe there's a foundation here that can be built on, but it'll take a while. We need the institutions. We need this general acceptance that certification is not a bad thing.
Right.
You know, it's not going to prove everything, but it's the way everybody else works. I think astrological exceptionalism, where we can do whatever we want and we're still a great field, is not a good thing. I mean, I think we need to understand that we can learn a lot from other subject areas, and including subjects, practical subjects like chiropractic or herbalism or something like that. Even they have certifications.
So in a sense, a cross-pollination of sorts, and just being well-read and in different other subject matters, because that's your whole point, really, is that astrology is a subject like many other subjects, but to broaden your horizons and to branch out. Like you said, your course in astronomy was fantastic, and it made me appreciate astrology even more. And also at Kepler, I loved doing initially I didn't, because I'm not a big fan of maths, but eventually when I was sitting there calculating charts by hand, I felt more intimate with the charts I was working with, because you're having to calculate, you're having to write down, then you're learning the astronomy on top of that, and these other subject matters that enrich the educational experience and the person, I think, as well.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I have a book called Astrological Chart Calculations.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, I was kind of proud of it. I liked it a lot. It doesn't sell very well. But I even go into the history of trigonometry, because in order to understand how to build a chart, you have to understand what's behind it. And when I learned how to cast a chart, it was pretty much, okay, this is the methodology and you follow it. And you do these calculations and so on. It was basically just arithmetic. But then I realized, well, how did you get there in the first place? And so in this book, I tried to highlight how we got to making a chart. You know, today most people just use tables, interpolation tables, and go to the ephemera. Well, you have to have the ephemeris. You have to start from there. But there's a long history behind the construction, the calculation of a birth chart, that is a major part of history of Western mathematics. Trigonometry, to a large extent, was driven by astrology, the needs of the astrologer. And the calculation of the ascendant itself, which is called the horoscope, right, is so challenging. You have to use information from 3 coordinate systems: the ecliptic, the equatorial, and the horizontal, the Earth system. So it's quite a challenge. I mean, that was a big breakthrough in the ancient world, is learning how to map the sky out that way.
So it sounds like people don't either know or appreciate the role of astrology in ancient times to other subject matters, to other areas, such as trigonometry, mathematics.
Yeah, that played a big role in astrology. Yeah, so that's why astrologers were often called mathematicians. In the Renaissance, astrologers were called mathematici, because you had to be a mathematician to do it. Right. And people like Regiomontanus were developing trigonometry, and Ptolemy was developing trigonometry. A lot of great astrologers were. Kepler was delighted when Napier came out with the logarithm tables, which were a way of reducing trigonometrical calculations to just addition and subtraction.
Fascinating. And I believe it's one of your preferred house systems, is it not? Regimentanus, is that not one of your?
Well, I wound up with sticking with Porphyry.
Oh, okay.
I did a little study about 30 or 40 years ago, and came to the conclusion that if you're going to test the houses in a chart, you're going to drive yourself nuts if you're going to test the influences of planets in the houses. In this house, in this chart system, you have Venus in the 3rd house, but if you use the other house system, it's in the, in the 4th house, right? So, or the 2nd house. It's that's going to drive you crazy, because that's subjective and you can't put units on it. But if you make the assumption that a house system is going to be valid, or at least usable, if the cusp itself turns out to be a sensitive point, sensitive to transits and progressions and solar arcs and so on. Then you can do something with it. So that's what I did. And I started out with about 8 or 9 different house systems, and I whittled them down to Placidus, Porphyry, Meridian, and Coke seem to deliver the most consistent results when a slow-moving outer planet or a progression passed over the cusp using an orb of 5 minutes of arc. Now, that assumed that my birth charts were spot on, and so I used just a few charts that I knew were absolutely accurate, that had been rectified to, the minute of arc, one of which was my own, obviously, or maybe not so obviously. But so I found that they all worked, those 4 worked pretty well based on cusps.
Right.
But Porphyry worked, I was very satisfied with Porphyry, but the best part about Porphyry is real easy to calculate. If you take an astrology exam, you can do it with Porphyry, and you can do it very easily. All you have to do is take them, calculate the midheaven and the ascendant, and then calculate the arc between them in zodiacal longitude, divide it by 3, and you're done. You're going to get the 11th and the 12th houses, right? You're also going to get the 5th and the 6th, the opposite. But it turns out the numbers that you get for the 11th and the 12th can be transferred to the 2nd and 3rd and 8th and 9th, just changing the signs, which you could do by just looking at, what the ascendant and what the 4th house and what the other cusps are. So I thought, this thing works. It's real easy to calculate. And this is in the days before computers. And so I went with it, and I've stuck with it ever since. Computers now, I just set it on Porphyry and go with it.
Fascinating. And that seems to be the advice now is, experiment with house systems, but go with one that works for you. And why do you think there has been such a contentious issue in astrology, house systems? It seems to be one, I've not been around long enough, but it seems to be something that people get in their camps with, or you'd think for an independent lot who live to let live, it gets very dogmatic, it seems.
Well, because it's whatever works for you, but what I'm saying is that at least I went far as determining which 4 were delivering in one area in the sensitivity of the cusp itself. And then I picked one of those because of its ease of calculation. But nobody does that. People just they're arguing, well, when if I have Mars in the 1st house in this one, but it's in in whole sign houses, but it's not in, because the ascendant, it's the end of Leo, or of some other sign. I'm trying to think of Trump's birth chart, right?
Oh yeah, he's got Mars right there on the ascendant.
Well, he's got Mars in the 1st house, no matter what way you cut it, I guess.
Yeah.
No, actually, what it is with Trump, that's why it popped into my head. 29 Leo rising, right? And his Mars is like at 26.
Right.
So with a regular house system, with normal house systems where the ascendant is the cusp of the 1st house, Mars is technically in the 12th.
Right.
If you use whole sign houses, he's got Mars in the 1st.
Right.
But I'm saying, well, this is kind of fuzzy anyway, because Mars is conjunct the ascendant if it's at 29 anyway. And Ptolemy said, I remember reading years and years ago in the early 70s when I was getting into Ptolemy, he said, well, any planet near the ascendant, would count. 5 degrees above the ascendant was very legitimate.
Yeah.
So I started looking at the angles as focal points of energy and not strict boundaries. Right. So
and those planets seem to be allowed. I mean, you take Trump, for example, what was it, 3 degrees applying, was it, to his ascendant? So these planets on the angles seem to be so loud, regardless if you take the house system from the 12th or the 1st, that if they're on an angle, they seem to be yelling, which Trump.
So what this comes down to, I mean, this is my argument, is that are the house cusps boundaries, or are they, attractors? So I made the assumption that they were attractors because you couldn't test the boundary very well, and because you get into subjective interpretations, right?
Yeah.
So I went to the attractor category and said, yeah, these 4 house systems do work as attractors. I was using an orb of like a degree at the most, or something like that.
Fascinating. Yeah. Wonderful. This is why I like, doing this Leaders in Astrology, but speaking to people with vast experience, that we, again, standing on the shoulders of the giants and learning from what's gone before us. I think that's really important for my generation and future generations, I think.
Well, knowledge of astrology it's a lot of work, as you know. There's a lot to it. And I was talking the other day and saying, feel like I'm just starting to get there in understanding, charts and how they work. I really need like 2 more lifetimes.
Yeah. 2 more lifetimes, 5 more planet Earths.
Yeah, well, right. Yeah. We ask for a lot, us Homo sapiens.
Fascinating.
Demanding species.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so on to our last question for today. What's coming up for the future for you? What have you got planned? You've got this fantastic book that's already out. You've alluded to some things, but what are your future plans? What are you up to?
Well, a lot of my time is involved in trying to maintain my health because I have spine damage from two accidents that, and surgeries and all. So I have to do a lot to just, basically what it is I'm slowing the entropy, the physical entropy, slow it down as much as I can. So I do a little bit with other things, and I got to clean up my house. My parents died in the last few years, and I got all their stuff, and my son has his stuff here, and I got to do that. And I have some music projects going on, some recordings I'm working on, and astrology. I thought this year I would just promote, the nature of astrology, and I'm trying to finish up some articles that I started writing and never finished.
Wonderful.
I'll see how far I get with all that.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm sorry to hear about your parents. It must be a lot of work to put everything together. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I going through probate. I'm the kind of guy. I have Saturn rising conjunct the ascendant, and I've been self-employed all my life. And my dad he's an engineer, but he came from a family of farmers.
Oh.
So I'm like, I just think something breaks, I fix it. I just go ahead and do stuff.
Yeah.
Well, so I did my mother died, my father died before her, but I got involved in legal stuff, probate and all. So now I got to sell some property.
Right.
Boy, was that draining. And those lawyers, they don't want to share anything, and my attitude was like, how hard can this be? Yeah, well, you know what? They make it hard. It's not that hard.
Right.
They got their own language, but then again, if they wanted to do some astrology, which wouldn't amount to any money for them, so they wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
They would have to learn the language too. So
right, exactly. Absolutely fascinating. Well, again, Bruce, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear your stories and your incredible body of work over time. So what I'm going to do is we're going to leave the link to the nature of astrology in the link in the description below. I also want to put your book of chart calculation down there as well. So where can I go and find that to stick that in?
You can get that on Amazon.
Okay.
You could. People are selling it. I got to say that there are 2 versions of it. The contents are exactly the same because I published it myself with my own little publishing company, One Read Publications, and it has a green cover. And do you know the Wessex Astrologer? Do you know Margaret from the Wessex Astrologer?
I'm familiar with Wessex. Yeah.
Yeah, she publishes out in England, and she saw it and she said, "Oh, I want to put this out too." And I said, "Okay." So I signed a deal with her, and she designed a different cover. It's like a dark cover, but it's exactly the same inside because I sent her the PDF.
Oh, is that right?
It's the same PDF, so the page count is the same. So you can get either one.
Wonderful. And we'll put that in the link description as well. I remember speaking to Bernadette Brady, and she was talking about the importance of getting published books from, reputable publishers and things like that, which is quite an interesting point, I think. But we'll put that. Thank you very much in the link in the description as well.
Good.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much, Bruce, for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, my pleasure, Cal. Nice speaking with you.
Thank you. Goodbye.